Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Psychedelic Scientist podcast. I'm really excited to be here with my guest, the pioneering psychedelic researcher, Dr. Robin Carhart-Harris. Although he really needs no introduction for anyone familiar with psychedelic science, I'll still give him one. So Dr. Carhart-Harris received his PhD in neuropsychopharmacology at the University of Bristol in 2012. And since then, he's been a pioneer in psychedelic science, being an author on over 100 scientific publications related to psychedelics, the most of anyone during this time, including the first ever fMRI brain imaging study of psilocybin, the compound in magic mushrooms, and the first brain imaging study of LSD. Also, since its launch in 2019, he's been the head of psychedelic research at the Imperial College London Center for Psychedelic Research. And starting this fall, he's moving over to California to be the founding director and the Ralph Metzner Distinguished Professor in Neurology and Psychiatry at the Neuroscape Psychedelics Division at the University of California, San Francisco. In addition, he also recently received the honor of being named one of Time Magazine's top 100 emerging leaders that are shaping the future. So welcome, Robin. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat today.
Oh, my pleasure, Manesh. Really pleased to be with you.
There are so many things we can discuss, most pertinently, given its upcoming release, the Imperial College London depression trial comparing the effectiveness of psilocybin therapy to escitalopram, which is a standard SSRI antidepressant. But before we get to that, I just wanted to explore a few other topics related to your research. I think a great place to start would be with just the question of how do psychedelics work? And I know over the past couple of years, you've released a few overarching theoretical papers which synthesize a lot of work, which I think have collectively outlined your current thinking in this area. Could you start us off by walking us through your current thinking in a nutshell?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, happy to. I guess maybe the best way to do this is to do it sort of layer by layer. And the truth is that, I've borrowed, as we do, from a lot of other people's discoveries. And a key one occurred in the mid-1980s, where it was discovered that a particular serotonin receptor appears to play a major role in the action of classic psychedelics like LSD. And over time, it's transpired that this is the serotonin 2A receptor. And still over time, and this is, fresh findings from only last year, we're discovering that there's something potentially quite special about this serotonin receptor. It's involved in brain growth, like literally it's involved in the growth and the expansion of the brain. It plays a role in embryo brains, or pre-brain in a sense, in terms of the growth of actual neurons, and it's the sheer number of neurons that we have as human beings that kind of, in a sense, defines us as our species. And so, this is a really important complex protein, transmembrane protein that sits in neurons. And this is where it all begins with psychedelics like LSD. And then we jump up a level. We know that this particular complex protein is important. And then you ask, well, what does it do? It seems to promote growth. As I said, in the embryo, this is growth of actual sort of pre-neurons or neural stem cells. In adults, it's the growth of synaptic connections involved in communication between the neurons. And we can, throw an umbrella over all of this and call it that kind of popular, almost buzz term, although it does have a concrete definition, plasticity. And we can say, oh, the 2A receptor like really, switches on plasticity with a vengeance. What is plasticity? It's the ability to be molded, to change, you might say. If it's neuroplasticity, it's changes in neuronal properties. And so, yeah, that's a key component. There's a lot more. We can look, for example, at the population level activity. So now we're talking about groups of many thousands of neurons, and we look at how organized their activity is, how synchronous it is, how rhythmic it is. And what we found is that under psychedelics, that rhythmicity breaks down and the activity becomes more chaotic, I suppose, to use a kind of popular term. Entropic would be a more accurate one. Complex would be another. Unpredictable would be another. And so this seems to be important. And another kind of umbrella term we could use here that is fair to use is the activity becomes dysregulated. And as that happens, so does the functioning that was served by regulated activity before it became dysregulated. And this dysregulation is happening at the population level in the cortex, that aspect of brain that humans have so much of, particularly for our body mass. And there's much more to the story. Right. Perhaps we'll get there, but that's a decent start, I think.
So essentially, they're catalysts for change in the brain, which might be in a healthier way, or a way that can be engineered through context.
Yes, I guess that's the next level to go into. We think of systems, high-level systems, and borrowing from I would say, increasingly influential, maybe even dominant model in cognitive neuroscience and psychology, hierarchical predictive processing, born out of the Bayesian brain, the idea that the brain and now the body and behavior are sort of emergent models of their environment. They come to model the environments that they exist in. And why do they do that? Well, Carl Friston would say to minimize surprise, and in a sense to have some kind of mastery in their environment, to find niche, to find a niche and exist in that, like a fish in water rather than a fish out of water,
Right.
And that's kind of what us living beings do. And so, with psychedelics, now this REBUS model that I introduced with Carl Friston a couple of years ago basically uses that general model and says, what psychedelics do in this framework is to relax the precision of these models. And when you do that, you make them more changeable, more moldable, more plastic. It's almost like by implication, they become, more amenable to change. And that's where you start thinking of things like, oh, well, you can make healthy change. Psychedelic therapy,
So basically, they're able to target the edifice that we've created to live in a stable and predictable world, right? Which is evolutionary advantageous because you want, as you said, to be able to feel at home in your environment, to be like, what's going to happen. It's not chaos all the time. Yeah. And I guess in psychedelics perturb this in a temporary way, which can go in either direction to kind of recrystallize a new framework, right? And something you've talked about in your work too is how these kind of processes or mechanisms can be activated outside of psychedelics, right? Because at the end of the day, we have the two-way system not for psychedelics, we have it for some endogenous purpose within our brain function.
Quite, yeah. And it's easy to get carried away with psychedelics, as some have, and be quite psychedelic centric in our thinking. And we might think, for example, that the two-way system exists for an endogenous psychedelic, and that was a popular idea in the 50s into the 60s as a potential explanation for schizophrenia. There's increased levels of an endogenous psychedelic driving psychotic processes. And then the other idea, equally kind of spine tingling in sort of appeal, is the stoned ape hypothesis of Terence McKenna, the idea that in hominin evolution, we started eating magic mushrooms.
Yeah.
That catalyzed the expansion of the cortex. And until this publication last year in Cell, I think it was, that linked two-way signaling to cortical development, that was kind of people would scoff, and I would scoff, if I'm honest, at that hypothesis. These days, when I take that hypothesis to people that have never heard it before, but are, specialists in brain development, like the authors of that Cell paper, they look at me quite soberly and they think, well, that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's a big change over the past decades of people like kind of scoffing, as you said, at that theory.
But I guess to come back to your point, the more sober kind of Occam's razor, more plausible explanation is that the 2A system exists for serotonin. It's the serotonin receptor, and serotonin, activates it and is the natural ligand, as we say, or key for that lock. And so then, I guess I started playing, always through reading, but playing with the idea that, what does it do? Why is it evolved? And under what conditions does that system engage? Under what conditions outside of the context of taking psychedelic, which, like most drugs, hijacks natural function. And so, first of all, it was a matter of trying to understand what is that natural function, and then the wealth of evidence now is it's like a change system, a psychological change system. Then you ask, well, when do you need to change? And it stands to reason that if times are tough, adversity, and perhaps adversity beyond a threshold, you need to change. And when you think in that way, it puts an interesting spin even on things like psychosis, like beyond a threshold, something has to give, the center cannot hold, you got to change. And so, I guess for me, and this was introduced in the Pivotal Mental States paper published last year, I think. Is this idea that can potentially, it says basically this is a change system. We can be agnostic about whether that change is good or bad. In a sense, it's always adaptive, but in the case of schizophrenia, you would sort of say, well, that's maladaptive, But in the case of going from, intractable depression towards remission, you would say, well, that's a healthy change,
Right. Something I find very interesting in terms of psychosis is that it's not it's often not a transient episode that is the biggest difficulty. It's that when it's chronic and it continues. So it's almost as if 2A activation in that sense, in that context, catalyzed this state of plasticity, but then somehow it got its own wheels and kept going. Can you speak to that? It's a very interesting idea, that because of course an important distinction between a psychedelic state and psychosis is, one is you don't know when it's going to end.
Well, absolutely. And I think that context dependency is the critical factor that largely determines whether you pivot towards pathology through one of these. I sort of say the pivotal mental states is bottom line, that's the foundation. And then psychosis might be one outcome, a psychotic disorder might be one outcome, or like some kind of spiritual epiphany and breakthrough might be another. And what determines like whether you pivot to one or the other? And it's that, I guess models are always too simplistic, and it's easy to say, it's always one or the other, because sometimes it can be kind of vague whether someone, has developed psychosis or has come upon some kind of powerful sort of personal development or growth or spiritual growth, but the principle is that it's a key property of these states that you're, first of all, hypersensitive to contextual conditions, and that contextual conditions probably therefore are critically dependent on where you pivot, through those states. The other thing to say is that psychosis is a process. It's not a simple thing that wasn't there and then is there, or it wasn't there and is there and then is forever what it was when it first emerged.
Right.
And so, a lot of people have written about psychosis as a process, and that early on in the psychotic process, things are quite psychedelic, and then later on in the psychotic process, they're not. They're almost the inverse. Like someone becomes really canalized, is the term, like rooted and channeled in a particular way of thinking and being, where they're sort of the opposite of plastic. They're really sure that, well, at least for a period, that it's some complex, delusional system that's at play, or they show negative symptoms, a kind of blunting of their thought, and and then medications complicate things as well, of course. So,
yeah, it makes sense. Almost in a sense, in these people, they're in this hyperplastic state without resolution, and so at some point the brain, in virtue of its need for some kind of certainty, will lapse onto a particular perspective, which can be some delusion, but whatever allows them to get out of that chaos into something certain, regardless of kind of how much it mirrors reality. So that makes sense.
It does, doesn't it? And then it puts a interesting spin on psychosis, as and we can do this with other disorders. I guess it may be most obvious with something like PTSD, where that there's been a background of adversity. But in psychosis, you can see how it's functional in some sense. And probably because of that, clinicians know not to come in heavy-handed and tell their patients that they're delusional, because they realize that the delusion is serving them in some way.
Yes. To bring this conversation back a bit, like, can you speak to the conditions in which the 2A receptor will become activated to a significant degree? It's like, obviously it is through serotonin, but like, in what context would you say this would happen to people in their regular everyday experience?
Perhaps not in a regular everyday experience, but if you go through hardship, if your partner's leaving you, or your mother's dying, or you're moving house, or a mix of all these things, then your stress is increasing and you're going through some kind of period of kind of crisis. And the evidence is from animals, a lot of animal research, mostly because of the nature of, the sort of measurements that can be done there, that chronic stress quite potently upregulates this serotonin 2A receptor change system. And so I describe that as sort of priming the change system. If you think of it as like a change button, it becomes it sort of pops out and becomes more sensitive to being activated. And then the question is, well, what activates it? Well, short of introducing a psychedelic, releasing serotonin would activate it. And then how do you do that? Well, it's stress again, but it's acute stress. But I think if the system is so primed, it would take less serotonin release to kind of, plunge that button and put you into a hyperplastic pivotal mental state. But it's, I would say it's a background of adversity driving this crisis, and that situation of, okay, we're reaching a threshold now, the center cannot hold, something has to give, and there it goes into a pivotal mental state.
Right. And this makes sense, I guess, in terms of the brain trying to preserve itself. It's essentially, if stress is there, but it's not unmanageable, let's deal with it without inducing this hyperplastic state where everything needs to be revised and changed, but just like maintain it. And then when things get to a certain breaking point, and it's like, okay, this is not working. This passive response of just enduring it is not working. I need to totally change the whole system, right? And switch into something new. Something I've been wondering too is that, this kind of approach, this framework of describing it kind of emphasizes a negative stimulus that catalyzes it, right? But for example, let's say you're in the Grand Canyon and you're just taken aback by the immensity, and you have this experience of awe where you lose sense of your bodily boundaries, or you have this mystical experience. Do you think that the two-way system is somehow being invoked in that context, which is not necessarily negative?
I think that's a great question. I think that's a very good challenge to the model
Mm-hmm.
because it's sort of the same, it's very similar thing in terms of at least the epistemics of it, like the revelation or the furtherance of one's like self-knowledge and awareness. It's the same kind of thing. It's epiphany, you know.
Yeah.
And so the challenge to the model really is, can you have epiphany without having to go through a crisis to get there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
I think it's a great challenge. I wonder whether those kind of epiphanies are always as sort of psychedelic. I don't know. Yeah, at least they don't have the quality of being like a hero's journey, like you've gone through hell to climb, you know, and trek your way up mountains and then get to the viewpoint and look out. I don't know. Also, another thing to say is things happen at altitude, like hypoxia.
Right. Yeah, that is true.
Hypoxia is a really reliable way it transpires to
Yes, yes.
increase 2A availability.
Mm-hmm. No, it's very interesting because perhaps another way to think about it is that 2A activation is proportional to like system overwhelm. And this overwhelm can be aversive, it can be negative in terms of like psychological pressure and stress, or it can be positive in terms of being overwhelmed by beauty and bliss and joy, and like kind of the immensity of the universe, right? And it could
Yeah,
be that overwhelm can also trigger in a similar way to stress, perhaps.
yeah. Actually, I think that's a good way of saying it, because then you can think of the systems like beyond the 2A receptor. You know,
Mm-hmm.
what's the system level change? And we might get onto hierarchies and you know, some work that we've been collaborating on, the flattening of hierarchies, if you want. And you might see the same system level change, like dominant hierarchical systems lose the sort of power of their governance over the rest of the system, whether they're, you know, initiated through a serotonin 2A receptor agonism or something else. Yeah, it's like the same, complex system level, dynamic system level effect that is perhaps the kind of the you know, closer mapping to these states than them always. Yeah, I guess the 2A receptor is a potent and reliable trigger, but maybe it's not always needed.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting to explore, because also in your pivotal mental states paper, you guys talk about how that whole concept of a pivotal mental state is meant to link diverse approaches to inducing these states, right? As in, I guess you guys mentioned fasting or sensory deprivation or self-harm, perhaps breath work.
Yeah.
And so it's very interesting how, yeah, it's obviously more research is needed to see the extent to which the 2A system is being activated in these states, but it does seem to present a potential intuitive unifying kind of framework. And then at some point, as you said, we'll have to go back beyond the 2A and see it within its kind of contextual embedding in terms of the entire brain, right? And
Yeah.
but it's a fascinating area.
Yeah, I mean, I guess drugs are very powerful scientific tools, and we can think, oh, can you have psychedelic states without zapping the 2A receptor? Well, you know, you can have psychedelic-like states through NMDA receptor blockade with ketamine-like drugs, and salvia has a different pharmacology, and ibogaine, you know. So then you realize, oh, maybe there's some similarities. They're not the same, but across these states, and maybe, you know, so you could say maybe it's like some glutamatergic dysregulation that's more kind of fundamental.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, of which the 2A is just a catalyst for. It's one of the
Yeah.
entry points into that system.
Yeah.
Which makes sense because serotonin is a neuromodulator, right? It works through the modulation of other systems. And yeah, so like I think we've been talking a lot about the receptor level, but I think a lot of people nowadays, when you think of psychedelic neuroscience, at least lay people, they think in terms of brain networks, you know, the default mode network and these images from the 2014 studies showing the brain interconnected on psilocybin. Can you speak to a bit, perhaps like bridging these two levels or what that would look like?
Yeah. I guess it's a good example of how science is moving all the time and evolving. Because if we rewind to our 2012, I think it was PNAS paper on psilocybin fMRI work, I think it's neurocorrelates of psychedelic state or something. There we looked at the default mode network, seeding the DMN with one of its regions, and then we see it's within network functional connectivity, the functional integrity of the network breakdown. And so begins a narrative, beware of narratives around the default mode network being central to the action of psychedelics. And here maybe are the neural correlates of ego dissolution, DMN, linked with the sense of self, a lot of stuff around that. What a beautiful story.
Yes.
Too beautiful.
Yeah.
And over time, we realize now that it's sort of the effect of psychedelics is certainly not specific to the DMN. The breaking down of distributed large-scale networks in the brain is actually quite a general effect of psychedelics. Most networks, most systems are broken down temporarily by psychedelics, not just the DMN. And then you plot relationships with subjective effects, and you find that again it's not just a breakdown in the DMN that relates to that big juicy one of ego dissolution. You can see other frontoparietal high level, always hierarchically high level. I think that's the more advanced story now, an accurate story that DMN sits at the top of the hierarchy, you might say, but it's not just the DMN, it's sort of DMN plus. And the breakdown of other frontoparietal networks will show relationships in the magnitude of that breakdown with the magnitude of ego dissolution. So self-rated ego dissolution. We're moving on, I think, from the DMN narrative into something a little bit more finessed and
right, as in it seems to be a product of these kind of areas in the brain default mode network frontoparietal, which are highly integrated, play a really large role, and these in particular are now becoming more integrated with the rest of the brain and mediating this information integration at this global level, of which the default mode network is a part, but it's by no means the only or perhaps the most important one in this context.
And so it's a kind of yin yang type thing, a positive to a negative. When you lose something, you lose the integrity of these networks, you lose the ego, so to speak. What do you gain? Well, the brain now looks more globally interconnected, and there is a felt sense of interconnectedness, beyond ego boundaries.
Yeah, and it's very interesting to think of the dynamics here as well, because I think something that Bayer is emphasizing is that most of these studies showing reduced default mode network integration are averaging over, let's say, 6 to 10 minutes or something like this. And as we know, like even phenomenologically, that 10 minutes is a highly diverse 10 minutes. It's not the same state continuously, right? So really, it is like we're in our infancy of trying to characterize the psychedelic state in general, because it's so complex and variegated.
Yeah, I mean, people pulled us up on, a title like The Neurocorrelates of the Psychedelic State. I remember hearing Bill Richards say, psychedelic state? What's the psychedelic state? So that's something for the future, to drill down into the psychedelic state to look at, periods of struggle, periods of bliss, periods of some kind of self-discovery or revelation.
Yeah. I guess along those lines, can you share like what you see as most promising for kind of furthering research into the neuroimaging of psychedelics?
Yeah, I'm really inspired. I mean, this is sort of I guess the field is so rich and lively now that a lot of people are having similar ideas. So I just sort of checked myself about whether I was going to give one away. But these things aren't trivial to do. But I think kind of decoding these states is a real tantalizing possibility, something I hope to be able to work on when I go to UCSF, collaborating with Berkeley and also, great people at UCSF, trying to, decipher what these psychedelic substates are. And that's a particular challenge because it becomes, a kind of machine learning challenge where the power of your predictive algorithm is dependent on the depth and richness of your data set,
Yes.
the training data set. So then the quest becomes, well, we need a big data set, and so that's where it begins. So it's certainly not a trivial undertaking, but that's a really juicy one, I think.
Yes. And I think the important thing is that we need rich brain data, but you also need rich subjective data. So we need, measures of people in an experience kind of mapping out the phenomenological landscape that they're moving through. And that's extremely difficult too, right? Especially given that they're in a brain scanner where they can't move and they're really restricted. Challenges moving forward.
And lots of experience sampling, like you said, you gotta, if you're not collecting the subjectives, then how can you say what it is? So, and then you have that classic scientific dilemma, the uncertainty principle, like phenomenon, where you come in to measure and then you disturb, perturb and you disturb. So you don't want to come in and measure too much, but then you have to come in and measure because otherwise you don't know what's going on. So it's about sort of sampling sparsely enough, but doing that often over a long periods of scanning that is the way to climb that hill, I think.
Yes. There's also like the decoding you mentioned, perhaps having one very large data set where you gain these models through which you could predict, like, is this person having a difficult or easy or ego dissolution experience? And then applying that to people who weren't probed in these ways and trying to predict their current state, their state dynamics. That something like that would be very, like a data-driven way of trying to find out where they're at, right?
Yes, and there lies the application value, because when you're doing psychedelic therapy, you often are like deeply intrigued. Where are they? And if you've got nothing other than just eyeballing them to tell you where they are, and you don't necessarily want to check in because checking in means sometimes disturbing people and upsetting their journey, then wouldn't it be great if you had some, I'm not suggesting we do our psychedelic therapy in the future while people lie in MR scanners,
right?
But maybe there's some other kind of proxy measure that you get through something like a non-invasive VG headset, or even something physiological that can give you a pretty reliable readout on where they are.
Yeah. Very fascinating. There's so much room for this area to like deepen our ability to track and measure these states, right? And so it's really exciting. So mindful of time, I want to move on to talking about the depression trial, which of course is a big thing. It's going to make a huge splash undoubtedly when it comes out. It's the first trial comparing psychedelic assisted psychotherapy to a standard antidepressant in a randomized controlled double-blinded study, and using escitalopram, which is it's kind of representative of SSRI antidepressants. And you guys use psilocybin in particular. Can you very quickly walk us through perhaps the motivation for this study on your end and also the study design?
I guess it's a combination of things inspiring the idea, the rationale, and part of it was, I guess I've been immersed in psychopharmacology somewhat as an outsider because I'm not a clinician prescribing, but I've been immersed in that since I started my PhD with David Nutt in 2005. And, I was attending the British Psychopharmacology Association meetings every year for like years on end. And so I know that world, and I was never convinced, and I certainly wasn't the only one, but I just didn't buy it. The sort of chemical causality hypotheses, and you see the influences, and then we did our first depression trial in treatment-resistant depression, and granted the sample is biased, one, because they are treatment resistant, so they'll have tried drugs and drugs haven't worked, so they have a downer on drugs, but it's more kind of what they were saying about the drugs. They're just a plaster over the root causes, and might help you get by, but they're not a long-term solution. And then when they responded to the psilocybin, they were like, it was just different in nature, almost like mirror opposites. One sort of blunting emotional responsiveness, taking the edge off, and then the other one like this big sort of opening, liberation. And so it was like, it became like, I describe it as a sort of, naughty idea, cheeky idea. Let's pit them together,
Right.
And so then it becomes, well, how do you do that? Because one treatment you take every day for weeks on end, the SSRI, the escitalopram, and then one is this like, sometimes a one-off, or in this trial, 2 dosing sessions with the psilocybin and a different kind of therapeutic container around that. So what we had to do was match those components in either arm. There were just 2 arms, so that you flip the coin and it's a random determiner whether you go into the psilocybin arm, as we call it, or the escitalopram arm. But then we have to match for all the different components. So all the psychological support, the preparing for a psychedelic journey, the supervision that you get with 2 guides or therapists, sitters that are with you for your journey, and then the integration that happens afterwards. We had to have all of that in the escitalopram arm. And also, if people are aware that they might get a whopping dose of psilocybin or not, then that doesn't help. But if you say everyone gets psilocybin, then everyone going into that first dosing session, you've standardized expectations for receiving psilocybin. So that's what we did. So when they went into the escitalopram arm, they actually got 1 milligram of psilocybin. So it wasn't active. We don't think a dose of 1 milligram is active, but we standardized the psychological component. Sure, that kind of strategy breaks down when people realize, I probably haven't got the big dose, but it's the best we could do. And some of these problems are kind of more or less impossible problems. But anyway, we matched for psychotherapy throughout. We also matched for actually taking capsules. So when you went into the psilocybin arm, getting the big 25 milligram dose of psilocybin, you would also take capsules every day, like you do in the escitalopram arm, except they're placebo capsules. So that was the design, and the motivation was this sense that these are 2 treatments. The SSRIs, they do something. They're not just placebo.
Yes,
it's something that they do, and what they seem to do is take the edge off. Whereas psychedelics work in a very different way, and that's where the strong prior hypothesis was, that we would demonstrate that different mechanism of action.
Yeah, great. So essentially, it was just, as you might expect, standardizing the procedure as much as is feasible, given the differences between the 2 approaches, and then putting them head to head in a little match with each other. So can you share a bit about the results? How did it go? And let's just start there. What were the results?
Yeah, sure. So, as is good practice in science, you define a primary outcome, and that's where you sort of, say, this is where I'm aiming, and this is the big test. And so it seemed like an anticlimax to some that there was not separation on that primary outcome. So the primary outcome is a measure called the QIDS, Quick Inventory of Depressive Symptoms, relatively new measure. It's more condensed, it's more focused on the diagnostic criteria for depression. It has what we call fewer degrees of freedom. It's a range of 0 to 27 versus like the BDI, another self-rated scale, which has a range like twice as big, up to 60 plus. So it's arguably a less sensitive measure. It missed on that primary, it almost separated, but it was like a -8 point drop for psilocybin versus -6 point drop with the escitalopram at the end of the trial. Now, if you assess the next day, there's significant separation, statistically significant separation. If you assess after 1 week, significantly significant separation. And then we had a bunch of other measures. We had 4 depression measures in total, very familiar measures like the HAM-D, the MADRS. And then we looked at a number of other outcomes that are important to people, like not just whether your depression drops, like it can with an SSRI, but do you feel good? Like, how's your well-being? Or do you feel like you're flourishing in life? So we measured that, and there was like a stark separation with psilocybin coming out on top. Then other stuff that is just like you want to see improve, like work and social functioning, that significantly favored psilocybin. So what I would say to people is view these results beyond their framing and use some common sense. And I actually think in hindsight, I mean, the paper's published now. In hindsight, we could have done the stats a little differently because a lot of these measures change together. They're correlated with each other. And so we could do some kind of factor analysis to show that there are some, general factors that interrelate very closely. And then, you don't have that problem of multiple comparisons.
Right.
In a sense, we took the lazy option there and just sort of sidestepped it and said, yeah, we didn't pre-plan to do a particular correction. And so we haven't. And then the editor said, well, then you can't conclude anything from your findings. Yeah. And so they were very firm. The editorial control on the writing of this paper was something that I've never experienced before. Review was, was kind of standard, quite quick, actually, quite swift. But then the subsequent editorial control was very hands-on.
Do you feel like it could have obscured actual findings by being too conservative, perhaps?
Yes, I do. I think the miss on the primary, it just, to anyone's common sense, looks like a false negative. Because you look at all of the other measures separating with 95% plus confidence that psilocybin is superior. And then, so I would say to people, use some common sense, but also if you want to play with the data, we can facilitate that as well. We've got other work coming, brain imaging work to do on these data. But when you look at remission rates of rounding 60% in psilocybin, in the psilocybin group at the end of the trial versus 30% with escitalopram, I think it's reasonable to say, you can make some of your own judgment there. We can be a bit religious about p-values and that whole kind of p-hacking sort of faithfulness. If you have remission rates that are twice as high at the end of a 59 patient head-to-head.
Right. And I think it bears mentioning that psilocybin, like it says escitalopram, you have to take every day and you're dependent on it, seemingly you are dependent on it in order to get these benefits, whereas psilocybin, they're not on anything afterwards. And it seems to be more of an organic kind of non-dependence related way of feeling better. I think that's a very important difference too.
Yeah,
right?
There's certainly no craving-like symptoms. You get discontinuation symptoms are quite well established now with SSRIs. They're very difficult to come off. And so that's one of the limitations with SSRIs. You don't see that with psychedelics. If anything, people say, never again or not for a while, even if they've had one of these epiphanies and therapeutic breakthroughs. They don't really want to repeat that anytime soon.
Yes, and I think your last outcome was 3 months prior to start of the trial. Is that correct?
We're doing follow-up analyses on 3 and 6 months, but they're not published. Yeah, we only report on 6 weeks because it's kind of neat, and that was the core trial period. That was a blinded trial period as well, because after 6 weeks, I think ethically you need to make a clinical call on what you do now. So that, and you can imagine at the start of the study, who's to say, I mean, certainly we had strong hypotheses, but who's to say that coming off your meds, which you had to do to come into the trial and then get no established antidepressant medication, who's to say that's ethical to do for any prolonged period? So what we were allowed to do was a 6-week trial, blinded, and then at the end of it, doctors can decide and patients decide what they want to do.
I see. I was going to ask you that if for the 6-month follow-up, if people are going to be off all drugs, for example, or not. Yeah.
This is one of the issues. We can't ask people to do that. So the data becomes confounded by the fact that they can't legally easily access psychedelics, but they can get SSRIs and other things. So it's going to be quite a messy data set in terms of confounding variables beyond the
out of necessity. Yes. So I have 2 more questions for you. One, if you were able to go back in time and redo the trial, what are some things you would change? Your favorite question, I'm sure.
I think it's drilled home to me the importance of pre-registration, which we did, but of course, this is like hindsight stuff. I would have been clearer and more kind of consistent on primary outcomes and primary hypotheses, because we had this unusual situation where you're forced to declare one primary outcome in the clinical trials pre-reg, and we put that on the fMRI, and then we said the QIDS is the primary efficacy outcome, and then our primary hypothesis stated in our pre-trial protocol was on no separation on the QIDS, our primary efficacy outcome, and separation on our measure of well-being, which is what we saw. And yet, because we didn't pre-reg well-being as the primary outcome measure, the editor said we couldn't report the p-value. And yet our primary hypothesis was separation. So that was kind of a bit rough. There were things like that where it's like, that doesn't feel like equipoise, really. You can live with it because first of all, it gets into such a high impact journal, and then it's reporting our results in the most conservative way we possibly could, and that's what this paper is.
Yes.
And one of the big issues, Michael Pollan's talks about it, and you can see it very easily in the whole psychedelic space, is this, unbridled exuberance, this, unchecked kind of optimism and romanticism around psychedelics. So you can see
been there for a while, right?
So in a sense, we've got really impressive results, I think, suggestive of, helping to contextualize the promise of psilocybin therapy. And yet we don't overplay it or oversell it at all. In fact, we kind of do the opposite.
It's great that it does that in a sense, and it also encourages people to take a more nuanced look at the data, right? So I think it'd be very interesting to see the media response to this study, because it really depends on how much they're actually looking at it as opposed to reading the first couple sentences in the abstract, right?
Yeah. What I would say to people listening to this is check out the supplementary appendix. A lot of results I would have liked to have gone into the main paper that were pushed into the appendix. So check those out. Data is data. It's not framing or spin. Look at those values and use some judgment.
Great. And my last question for you is, where now? Now that this depression trial is out, are there additional depression trials that you could speak to? Perhaps you can't, but what's the kind of orientation that you're moving towards now in terms of clinical?
Yeah. Well, personally speaking, I've set up a couple of trials with the team at Imperial. Want to look at anorexia, Meg Spriggs heading that one up, psilocybin for anorexia, small trial, a bit like our one in TRD, treatment-resistant depression, 20 patient open label. Well, not open label, actually, it's single blind. And then chronic pain, we're working towards doing that later in the year, and then more brain imaging research. And then there's UCSF and doing more mechanistic work there, which I'm really excited about. And then the field, really, I think now it's teed up for those who have the means to achieve licensing, yeah, it's for them to take this on and try and get to that, ultimate kind of yardstick. And that will happen while things like anomalous things like the Oregon Initiative get through.
Right.
They open it up, potentially having not gone through the traditional medical routes.
Right.
So there's a lot that's interesting that's happening, and I just hope, so long as it is all firmly kind of science driven and closely aligned with science, then that will look after the longevity of this space. If the exuberance gets ahead of itself, or the commercial forces get ahead of themselves, that's where, those are two areas where there could be cause for concern. There are others, so it's not going to be an easy road.
No. And this is definitely coming up in discussions more and more. And it's a whole huge can of worms we could spend another 2 hours discussing, I'm sure. So I'll leave it at that. But definitely it's like very interesting to see how it progresses in these kind of non-academic settings and non-scientific settings as there's more research supporting their viability as treatments. And I guess last thing, you're moving away from London to California, which is a huge change. It's a very large change. Can you speak a bit about your excitement or plans for the Neuroscape Center and maybe what drew you there?
Yeah, well, gosh, there's a few things. Adam Ghazali, the founder of Neuroscape, is a great guy. Him and his wife came to stay with us in Oxford in the UK and got on very well. And, the idea was kind of planted then. And there was just a lot about that move that was particularly appealing. The resources and the expertise that exists already in Neuroscape, the direction of things in psychiatry and in neuroscience, the increasing influence of technology, and Neuroscape being a kind of neurotech hub was appealing. And then you have other kind of human elements, like a wife hankering after better weather than we get in the UK.
Very reasonable. Very reasonable.
And a desire for change. I've been at Imperial for over 12 years, and it's been wonderful. And I owe a lot to Imperial and David Nart and people like Amanda Fielding, who backed my research early on. But it comes a time, I think, and when you can as well, like family-wise with a young family, it comes a time, I think, just to change it up, and live life and see what the next chapter holds.
That's great. Yeah. Seems like a very exciting new chapter with so much more potential. And I'm sure your mind will be sparked in many different ways by the academic climate out there too. So it'll be very nice. It's super exciting to see what will come of it in the coming years. And with that, to be super mindful of your time. Thank you again. It's been a pleasure to talk with you about these things, and hope to chat with you more in the future.
Yeah, likewise. Always a pleasure, Manesh.